Okay, hello. Both our lectures today are about 1989, a year, really one of the most transformative years, transformative moments in the history of Central and Eastern Europe, but arguably also one of the most transformative moments in European history, and perhaps also even in global history. This is the moment in Central and Eastern Europe when the entire communist edifice, which had seemed to be very durable and had to all sort of forecasters and all experts did not think that this was going to be disappearing anytime soon, that it was here to stay, just as the Soviet Union and the communist world more generally was. In the space of a very short period of time, basically across an entire year, every single one of these communist regimes collapsed in short order, beginning with sort of Poland and Hungary, and then moving across the bloc and taking up pretty much everything. Now, there's a few sort of important points to be made about this. The first is that, as we'll see, the revolutions were largely velvet revolutions, which is to say they were peaceful revolutions. Almost no violence, no killing during this, in most of the bloc, during this remarkable and transformative year. Now, that also is something that demands explanation, and something that is quite surprising. It's not often that a regime relinquishes political power without some kind of violence. We will know this, of course, from knowing a little bit about, for example, Irish history. Even though there was ultimately a peace settlement, it came after a period of pretty intense conflict. So it was quite a surprise, and when people would look back in 1989, those people who came out onto the streets. And those people who led the revolutions against the communist regime, some of the people that we've met already, people like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia and Lech Walesa in Poland. They too had this on their mind, of course. They would look back at things like Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. They might think about what the Soviet Union was doing in Afghanistan from the end of the 1970s onwards. We'll talk about the conflict that they were involved in a moment. They might think about what seemed to have almost happened in Poland in 1980. No Soviet intervention, but indeed Polish tanks on the street, martial law, and everybody, amongst many people, an expectation that there would be violence as well. So it came as quite a surprise, ultimately. Now, of course, during this year, if we think globally, there was violence. In fact, quite intense violence, quite serious violence. It was not in Europe. It was in China. A student protest on Tiananmen Square against the Communist Party. The communist regime in China had many of the hallmarks of the kinds of revolutions that we'll be talking about today. The key difference is that the Chinese Communist Party, the regime, fought back. They successfully suppressed this student revolt, and they did so with considerable loss of life. Of course, to this day, we don't know how many people were killed by the Red Army, by the Chinese People's Army, but indeed it's likely to be thousands of people rather than hundreds of people. So it was not a foregone conclusion that there would be no violence, but in fact, there wasn't, and then this sort of needs to be understood. Now, there were some exceptions to this peaceful rule, to the rule of the Velvet Revolutions of 1991. One exception, which we'll be talking about not in these sessions, but the ones that will come, which I'll post in the final week, was Yugoslavia. We've talked a little bit about that country before. We know that Yugoslavia was, since the end of the Second World War, a communist state. The end of communism came around about the same time as it did in the rest of the bloc, give or take a couple of years. But in this case, it was the collapse of communist rule in Yugoslavia also meant the collapse of the state itself, and that was accompanied by extreme ethno-nationalist violence, the most terrible of which was in Bosnia. So that's one exception. Another partial exception will be Albania. We're not going to talk about state too much this week. But the communist regime didn't end in 1989. It ended a little bit later, in 1991, and the revolution was not clear that this was a fully fledged revolution, at least not immediately. The people who took over in 1991 were sort of reform communists. So they were the same people who would just kind of shed their communist affiliation, and that was also something which was not entirely unheard of in the bloc. Now, the other important exception is Romania, a country that we haven't really spoken about on this module yet, but we will devote an entire session, which is just beneath this one, talking about why Romania's 1989 was very different, and indeed was quite a violent moment in Romania's history. Okay, now let's go to the slides. In order to understand why things changed and how they changed in 1989, we need to go to the source of power in the communist bloc in Europe. And of course, this was not in Warsaw, this was not in Bucharest, this was not in Prague, this was in Moscow, this was in the Soviet Union. To a certain extent, many weeks ago at the beginning of this module, I talked about how back at the end of the Second World War, Stalin had serious security concerns. And for this reason, ultimately decided to extend his western border into Central and Eastern Europe, and to more or less impose upon the people in this region a system of communist government. That there had been, if we turn to slide number 3, there had been very, very many hard lessons for the people in Central and Eastern Europe about the limits of their own independence and the limits of their own autonomy. Ostensibly, in the system of international relations, the states in Central and Eastern Europe were independent sovereign states. They were linked to the Soviet Union through the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the military alliance. They were also linked to the Soviet Union and, of course, to one another through Comecon. Not the comic conference in where it is San Diego every year, but an economic partnership of partner communist states. But in reality, the Soviet Union, to a greater or to a lesser extent, called the shots. And Eastern Europeans, Central and Eastern Europeans, had been given a painful reminder of that several times throughout the history of the Cold War. And we've talked about most of them. We looked at how in Poland, and particularly in Hungary, in 1956, a reform movement got out of hand and resulted in Soviet invasion and a small-scale, low-intensity conflict at the end of 1956. And we'd also seen a couple of weeks ago, hadn't we, that in Czechoslovakia, once again, a reform movement had spread in the country under Alexander Dubček and a group of like-minded intellectuals. It had gotten out of hand, and once again the Soviet Union had invaded, this time at the head of a Warsaw Treaty Organization armed force, so also armies from Poland and from Bulgaria and from East Germany. Now, a couple of things happened after 1968. On the one hand, as I'd mentioned, many people abandoned the notion that there was any hope in reforming this system. The belief was that you could only go so far if you tried to excuse me. music has started playing. If you went too far, then you could only go too far. You could only be so sort of creative. You could only be so reformist. You would reach a certain point. It would not be very far, and then the Soviet Union would launch some kind of invasion. The whole thing would be stopped in its tracks, and in many cases, everything, all the things that you had worked for, all the things that you had gained would be reversed. Now, Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union from the middle of the 1960s onwards, and during the time of the Prague Spring, laid these out in relatively clear terms in the wake of the Prague Spring and in the wake of the Soviet invasion, the Warsaw Pact invasion. He laid out what was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. We talked a little bit about it a couple of sessions ago. But Brezhnev essentially was saying, if something gets out of hand, if there are hostile forces within one state, then it will be a concern for all of the states, including, of course, the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union will take drastic and necessary measures. Now, if we turn to slide number 7, we can have a quick recap, since we're talking about the Soviet Union, of the leaders of this state since the end of the Second World War. Of course, initially, the most important person up until his death in 1953 was the Vozhd himself, Joseph Stalin. And under Stalin, in the Soviet Union, but also in the Eastern Bloc, up until the sort of the mid-1950s, this was really a period of kind of terror, a period, as we've seen, of political oppression, of arrests, of non-judicial killings, of show trials, throughout the bloc, right up until sort of, as I say, the middle of the 1950s. Now, when Stalin died, he was ultimately replaced by the reforming leader Nikita Khrushchev from 1954 until 1953, approximately 1953, until he was ousted in 1964. The period, in many cases was much more relaxed. It was kind of the end of terror. It was an era of Khrushchev attempting to cultivate better relations with the Eastern Bloc, Khrushchev's strenuous efforts to bring Yugoslavia